Chapter 5. A New Trial. After 7 years in prison, much of it in segregation, Leslie was granted a retrial by the California Court of Appeals. Because her attorney had disappeared, she should have been granted an immediate mistrial. Thus, the basis for the appeal. In 1976, the Court of Appeals threw out her first conviction and requested a new trial for Leslie for early 1977. This window of hope was met of the assiduous work of her lawyer, Max Keith. Keith first met Leslie at the conclusion of the first trial when he was brought in at the end without time to prepare. He gave the closing arguments on Leslie's behalf and saw her through the death penalty phase of the trial. He did as well as anyone could have, but at the time Leslie was not cooperating. Now he was back, well-informed, with a commitment to reopen the case. The grounds of her defense would be diminished capacity. For the first time, she would be tried without her co-defendants. In the technical realm of law, she had a clean slate. She was not yet guilty because she had not yet received a proper defense. In late 1976, Leslie was transferred from CIW, 60 miles east of Los Angeles, to an isolation cell in Sybil Brand Jail in the city to await and then attend trial, and to await resentencing. I was allowed regular 20-minute visits with her over the course of many months, seated in tiny facing cubicles, speaking over a phone, with our conversations monitored, with a bulletproof glass partition separating us. We'd been acquainted for 5 years. We talked about the upcoming trial, her family, my children, mutual friends from the university tutorial program, books we were reading. The outcome of the trial, a headline story for the press, would radically affect the rest of her life. But she stayed calm. The Barbara Walters interview. Women's movements in the 1970s produced many changes, and token females were surfacing in jobs formerly closed to them. One of these changes was that, in late 1976, Barbara Walters moved from NBC to the ABC Evening News as the first woman in the USA to anchor a network news program. She also continued to do special programs and personal interviews. 3 months after she began her new job, she scored a coup, an interview with Leslie, who, because of the impending retrial, was back in the news. It was almost midnight in Los Angeles in 1977, just prior to the beginning of Leslie's second trial. In the company of friends, I flipped the TV switch to ABC just in time to hear Geraldo Rivera announce that the now very famous Barbara Walters would be appearing on the show and would be presenting her recently taped interview with the very infamous Leslie Van Houten. The show's band played Stevie Wonder's song, Isn't She Lovely?, as the camera cut to Walters. Rivera introduced her as someone who had interviewed Leslie. He then summarized the crime and explained that Leslie's conviction had been overturned and a new trial was pending. Then, with typical Rivera drama, he asked Walters, "Do you think that it's possible that Leslie Van Houten, Manson follower, will be paroled?" Rivera and Walters discussed this possibility. Under California sentencing practices in the 1970s, first-degree murder convictions commonly led to parole after 10 to 12 years in prison, unless the person was deemed a clear and present danger to society. Walters pointed out that Leslie could be acquitted. If not, she speculated, her release on parole would depend on her ability to demonstrate that she had been rehabilitated. Rivera said that it was a chilling thought, that anyone connected with Manson could be released soon, or ever. He then played excerpts from the taped interview, after indicating that he too would be seeing it for the first time. This was Leslie's first televised interview. It took place in the lineup room at Sybil Brand. For the first time, the nation had a close look at the woman who had outgrown the Leslie depicted 6 years earlier. In 1971, she had come down the hall of the court building with Pat and Susan, smiling for the cameras, always smiling and singing, obviously as unconcerned about her own fate as she was about that of her victims. In Walter's 1977 tape, the change in Leslie was striking. Her appearance was wholesome. Her dark hair was turned under in a classic bob. Her bangs covered the scar of the X she had cut into her forehead during the first trial in obedience to Manson. She had a calm, feminine appearance on the TV screen and still looked like the homecoming princess she had been. Barbara Walters. Tell us about Charles Manson. Did you think he was Jesus Christ? Was he your lover? Was he your friend? What was the relationship? Leslie Van Houten. I think at one point I really believed he was Jesus Christ. Was he a lover to the various girls who lived there? Yes. Was he yours? No. We went to bed together a couple of times, but I didn't consider him a lover. What do you feel about him today? I was a pawn in whatever his scheme was. I'm glad that I'll never again have to see him. Do you remember the LaBianca murders? Yes, I remember it. I'm not able to speak of it now, owing to the impending trial. Can you tell us why you think you took part? At the time, it was supposed to help people. What was supposed to help people? The crime. It was supposed to start a revolution that would clean the souls of everyone. But murder, at the time, murder, didn't that mean anything to you? I had been taught by Manson that there was no such thing as death. It's hard for me to speak of it now because I'm back to my normal way of thinking. Now I can't conceive it, but back then death wasn't supposed to mean anything. I'm going to talk to you very straight at this point. There is a possibility that you may be paroled, that at the end of your trial, you may be freed. There will be a great many people who will look at you and say, "This girl is a murderer. Don't be fooled by that pretty innocent face. This is a girl who killed. It's 7 years later and she wants to be let out. And she shouldn't be. She killed." What do you say to those people? I know that there are many who feel that way, and I can understand their feelings. I feel now I will be able to go back and tell the truth, which I didn't in the first trial because Charlie was conducting the courtroom. What do you mean? He was telling us what to say, when to stand up, when to carve the X, when to shave our heads. Every day it was a new agenda, what we should do for the day. After playing her clips, Walters continued speaking with her host, Geraldo Rivera. There are people who ask, why do you put a murderer on the air? If you are in the news business, you try not to have a point of view, and try not to give a particularly sympathetic point of view. I don't know what's going to happen to this girl. And it's not up to me or to you or to any of us to make that judgment. Talking to Leslie is something many news reporters wanted to do, and we were able to do it first. Geraldo had the last word. Clearly taken with Leslie, he changed his tune. Let people see what she's about. I mean, she's a flesh and blood person. Let them see what she thinks and feels. The things that motivate her. I think it's all educational and informative. The friends who watched Dorado with me that night were all hopeful that the interview would help bring Leslie an early release. With her open face and calm, straightforward answers to Walters's questions, she seemed to have diffused the high drama associated with the Manson murders. She gave a human face to the very sane young woman she had become, effectively erasing the eerie media images of her days as a teenaged Manson girl. It was a turning point. From that night on, the tone of the press seemed more weighted in Leslie's favor. During the second trial, Leslie's mother and I took time for visits with each other away from jail and prison, sometimes after one or the other of us had visited Leslie. There would be messages to carry, offering encouragement and requests from Leslie for books and personal items. Jane prepared delicious meals for her family and friends, and we enjoyed sharing mutual tastes in classical and other music. My son Todd, then 16, came along on one occasion, and he too was charmed by Jane, by her gentle, calm demeanor, her good food, her concern for everyone. She put us at ease. A death at the jail. Several of Leslie's friends in Los Angeles took turns taking notes at the second trial to circulate among those who couldn't be in court. On some days, the courtroom was packed. All of us who arrived early stood in line for hours in any weather. Before entering the courtroom, we were all thoroughly searched. Family members, friends, students, curiosity seekers, and the press alike. During the testimony about Helter Skelter and the portended race war, many people of African heritage showed up. Some would wince whenever the prosecutor would use the word nigger in reference to Manson's racism. One day, about 20 high school students with their teacher entered the courtroom during Leslie's sensitive testimony about the family's belief in a bottomless pit. The students were stopped in their tracks, visibly shaken by what they were hearing. Leslie herself found it hard to accept that she could ever have believed anything so strange and awful. Outside on the courthouse steps during breaks, some of the spectators got acquainted with each other. One teenaged girl told me she personally identified with Leslie and had written an essay analyzing her dreams about her. While this girl talked, radiating enthusiasm, I was reminded of how Leslie could beam with optimism in the gloomiest of situations. This was the quality that the teenager had recognized in Leslie. A deep potential for joy, completely incompatible with the crime for which she was being retried. Unlike our hours-long, face-to-face visits in the state prison, our visits in the jail were generally limited to 20 minutes. We sat facing each other in a booth with a glass partition, talking by phone, guards posted behind us. We spoke over the voices of other visitors and prisoners who were trying to hear each other in cubicles to our left and our right, about 40 of them. It was common for as many as 200 people to visit prisoners on a given day. Many visitors were women with children or elderly people. Many came a long distance to visit a family member, and like me, would wait for hours to get in. Many were turned away. Inside, the visiting room was crowded, hot, and noisy. People spoke tensely over their phones in several languages with raised voices. Through this din of voices and of doors clanging, bells ringing, children crying, and guards barking orders, Leslie and I would talk. We talked about how truth is not static, but rather a product of historic process. She would tell me why she liked certain authors, such as Lillian Hellman. She was interested in the work of Albert Camus, who said something about intelligence in chains gains in intensity, what it lacks in lucidity. Leslie herself was certainly lucid. One evening toward the end of the visiting period, a troop of guards came in and took all the visitors except me out of the building. Then they moved all the prisoners except Leslie back to their cells. A crisis had occurred at the outside gate, they explained, and all the guards were needed to respond to it. We just looked at each other, bewildered. It was eerie for the two of us to be, suddenly, entirely alone, in a deadly quiet room, amid the rows of empty cubicles with their phones and glass partitions. Time passed slowly. Tightly locked in, with no way of knowing what was happening, we made small talk, with awareness that the guard in the control room was monitoring our words. Self-consciously, we spoke about whether we were losing or gaining weight, what we thought about the then new masculine fashions, retro 1940s, in women's magazines, and which places we'd like to visit around the globe. After an hour or so, one guard came for Leslie and another for me. When my escort and I reached the high metal gate at the entrance to the grounds, I saw a dead man, an African American, lying in a massive pool of his own blood. It looked as if he had taken bullets from several angles. He appeared to be tall, slender, good-looking, and in his late 20s or early 30s. His blood had run in streams all over the sidewalk and was already crusting. Only now could the sounds of an approaching ambulance be heard. I stopped and asked what had happened. The guard steered me around the body and firmly led me to my car. Then he answered some of my insistent questions. He said that the dead man had been waiting a long time in the visitors' line, waiting to see his girlfriend. When they told him the visitors' quota was filled for the night, he had become furious. He refused to leave, made threats, and pulled a gun, the guard said tersely. In the ruckus, he had been shot down. The guard went on to explain why they'd kept Leslie and me in the visiting room alone. They had needed to send the visiting room guards outside to deal with the chaos. It wasn't hard to herd the others out quickly. But Leslie was a priority, highest security prisoner, who needed a special escort to return her to her solitary basement cell. So it had been best to leave her locked with her visitor, monitored from the control room, until the staff returned to their posts. There were two questions the guard refused to answer. Why had it taken so long to call the ambulance for the man? Had the man been shot before or after the visitors had been evacuated? No TV station reported the killing that night, and it wasn't in any of the papers the next day. So I made several phone calls to the media to see if they knew about the incident. Most were indifferent. One television station manager said he would have it investigated, but it never came to light. A black guy with a gun in his pocket being shot by jail guards is not newsworthy in a city where hundreds of people are murdered every year. I did not speak of the incident with Leslie until she was out on bail a year later. She said, "It was barely a tiny bleep in there. The guilty officers are probably still on the streets." One of the paradoxes of jails and prisons is that it is there, in those most rule-ridden institutions of society, where the most lawless activity can take place with impunity. It is the guards who wield the frontline power. They decide if a person has broke a rule and whether an incident constitutes an emergency, in which case anything goes. Prosecution and defense. The trial was heavily weighted on both sides by professional experts who were brought in to testify. The implication was that they could speak better for Leslie than she could speak for herself, that their authority was crucial to finding the truth. Leslie's family and friends gave her support in the courtroom just by being present, but she was under guard and unable to communicate with anyone directly. Important to the defense was the testimony of former Manson devotees, including Linda Kasabian, who had received immunity in 1970 for testimony that convicted Manson. When first charged with murder and conspiracy, Leslie was also offered immunity in exchange for testimony, but she refused to cooperate. Subsequently, neither the Los Angeles Police Department nor the district attorney's office would acknowledge that they had made the offer. Leslie had been a true believer who accepted Manson's interpretations of her own experience, even in the face of the death penalty. The testimony at her second trial of 5 other people who had been associated with Manson was consistent. They were all describing a cult and regarded Manson as someone with exceptional powers to sway people. Kasabian testified that he had programmed them into being virtual zombies. Leslie was being tried not as a disciple, however, but as an individual who knew right from wrong and who had made the worst possible choices. She was tried not as a victim of a predatory cult leader, but rather as a victim of her own poor judgments, choices, and actions, for which she was to be held responsible and culpable. In her defense, Max Keith introduced a cassette of Manson's voice in an interview. As the tape played, no one in the packed room made a sound. Jurists, press, spectators. The staccato force of his voice got everyone's attention. Of Leslie, Manson said, spitting out the words. People had Leslie Van Houten long before I had her. Her mother had her first. Her dad had her. Her parents had her. Her school had her. The TV had her. The movies had her. She was in a convent for Buddhists. The Buddhists had her. And you come up and say, well, you had influence over her. I showed her the way to herself. Manson then explained how a woman's aura tells who she is by the color she emits. As he saw her, Leslie's color was green. Let's look down to the ground and see what we're going down on the earth. That's where we're at, and I say, Green, I'm going to name you Gentle Tree, and I'm going to plant you here, so that you can help fix the earth. And she was planted for peace, and she was planted for the world. The prosecuting assistant district attorney, Stephen Kay, had helped Vincent Bugliosi prosecute the Manson defendants toward the end of the first trial. In this retrial, he was trying Leslie for conspiracy to murder. This allowed him to introduce evidence of the Tate murders, more sensational than the LaBianca murder she had taken part in, even though she had been at the Spahn Ranch caring for children when the Tate murders occurred. She had no advanced knowledge or any voice in the matter. Kay's conspiracy theory contended wrongly that, before the Tate murders, Leslie knew that murders were being planned. He treated the 2 nights of Manson murders as a singular phenomenon, as the signature crime of the 20th century, a crime that required retelling to bind everyone to the hard truth of it. He put enlarged color photos of the Tate murder victims before the eyes of Leslie's jury. Kay's focus on the violent details of a crime in which Leslie did not participate had the effect of distracting from, rather than emphasizing, the deep tragedy suffered by the LaBianca family. In 1969, Leslie knew, theoretically, that Manson wanted his followers to be able to die and to kill in order to bring about helter-skelter, the race war that would result in social revolution. She was concentrating on killing her own ego, which meant obeying Manson without question. With the rest of the family, she had been using drugs and was being brainwashed by Manson's hypnotic, biblical exhortations and metaphors gleaned from Beatles songs. She gave herself to Manson to be an instrument for his grand vision. Testimony. After listening to the recounting of the crimes in Leslie's second trial, a Los Angeles Times reporter lamented that this pathetic and horrible story made no sense and concluded it seems both impossible and inevitable that it ever happened. We say that a crime is senseless when the motives aren't evident or don't make sense in our own frame of reference. We especially call crimes senseless when the victims are children, the disabled, or the aged, and emphatically innocent of any provocation. A crime is quintessentially senseless when the perpetrator likewise seems unaware of the gravity of the act, as when children commit murder. When a woman kills an abusive husband, she can now expect a certain level of judicial or community sympathy. The mindset that results from her victimization is often treated as a mitigating circumstance. The Manson murders were a convolution of the victim-oppressor type of murder. Instead of killing the man who was oppressing them, the women tried to kill women for him. Leslie said she was willing to attempt murder because I wanted to let Manson know I was a good soldier and that I was willing to lay my life on the line for him. Leslie's defense strategy was based on what occurred: brainwashing. Ample evidence was presented about ways that individuals can be seduced, disciplined, and coerced to adopt beliefs antithetical to those previously held, and to follow orders issued by those who do them harm. The brainwashing was compounded by the power dynamics between the older man and the younger women who were sexually exploited. As Anne Neer reflected on it, she said, "The aspect of the crime that is hardest for me to comprehend is that of a woman holding a woman to be killed, at the behest of a man responding to a sense of impending chaos. This seems to reveal an extraordinary void in a sense of bonding between women." The sex of the victims, however, wasn't relevant to Manson on those 2 August nights. In the course of the second trial, presided over by Superior Court Judge Edward A. Hintz, Jr., dozens of witnesses testified to Leslie's good character before she met Manson, including family friends who had known her whole life. Repeatedly, they testified to her healthy relationship with her parents, her wholesome childhood, and teenage contributions to the community. They also spoke of her diminished judgment after habitually ingesting LSD and submitting to the domination of Manson. They emphasized that more recently, for several years, she had shown clear signs of having been rehabilitated. To friends and family, she showed profound remorse and had firmly repudiated Manson's authority. The courtroom was hushed during the tearful, wrenching testimony of Rosemary LaBianca's daughter, who, at age 21 with her boyfriend and her 15-year-old brother, had found their parents brutally murdered. Her face showed great pain as she recalled that night, but she did not express anger or share the prosecutor's face on retribution. She and the defendant did not look at one another. The daughter deep in sorrow, the guilty woman deep in shame. The testimony of the daughter who lost her mother was followed by the testimony of the mother who almost lost her daughter to the death penalty. Jane Van Houten related details of Leslie's upbringing, her involvement in church choir, social groups, marching band, student government. She told how well Leslie got along with others, how she was elected homecoming princess 2 years in a row. She spoke of how, when Leslie was 16, her abortion was very sobering to the family. Jane told how she tried to discourage Leslie from her transient, barefoot hippie life. When Jane was asked whether she thought Leslie was free of Manson's influence in 1977, Jane replied, "Yes, I certainly do." The change became discernible in 1974 or so. That Leslie had regained her mental health was obvious to all who knew her in 1977, as well as to courtroom spectators. The prosecutor, Stephen Kay, was very hard on Jane Van Houten in his cross-examination. He said to her, I take it you don't want your daughter to be in prison. Jane, fighting tears, agreed. I don't want her to be in prison any longer. Kay then insinuated to the court that Leslie's mother would lie to free her daughter from prison, although there was nothing to lie about because the facts were clear. Keith returned for one last question. Have you been telling us anything untrue to keep Leslie out of prison? Jane responded with calm dignity. I've been telling the truth, and I don't want her to be in prison anymore. During the months of Leslie's retrial, the testimonies of 3 individuals made a particular impression on me and moved me towards some clear understandings. Paul Watkins, a former family member who left the ranch before the killing began. Dr. Lester Grinspoon, a psychiatrist who testified about the effects of LSD. And Leslie herself. May 1st through 3rd, 1977. Former cult member Paul Watkins, sexy and witty, helped find pretty young women for Manson to invite in. He testified that Manson didn't like being identified with hippies, despite the lifestyle of his family, and despite the fact that several of his followers were free-spirited adolescent refugees from hippie families. Manson thought of hippies as unproductive people, and he was intent on saving the world. So, as Paul related, we're slippies. We would slip in and out of society without creating much problem. Watkins, on the stand for 3 days, described how Manson supported his claim to be the apparent reincarnation of Jesus Christ by reenacting the crucifixion. Manson became preoccupied with death in those last months before the murders, Watkins said. He rapped at length on what the metaphysical aspect of death was. Death is an illusion. There is no death. He talked about being willing to die, the next step. If you can die so easily, how do you feel about dying for me, if I ask you? Watkins' testimony clearly supported the view that followers had been systematically brainwashed to be pliable enough to attempt to kill someone on his instruction, or to let themselves be killed. It occurred to me, as I listened to this testimony, that Manson himself was the victim of a kind of brainwashing from his many years in prison, where violence is glorified and the macho man is pitted against the wimp. The prosecutor played the Beatles' White Album in the courtroom, music that had been so significant to the family's brainwashing. Instructed by Kay, Watkins received the relevance of each song. Blackbird was a call to the black man to rise up. Sexy Sadie was about Susan Atkins. Piggies was about the gluttons of society who deserved extinction. Helter Skelter was their mission. Revolution 9 was a game plan. Watkins' testimony supported Leslie's defense. He conveyed the enormity of Manson's spell over all of them. Leslie maintained upright posture as she listened with sorrowful poise to his testimony. Paul Watkins' testimony caused me to reflect on how reverberations from the Manson murders affected the lives of counterculture people throughout California and beyond. Since Manson and his followers were reasonably perceived to be hippies, all hippies became suspect and ready targets for disdain and harassment. After the crime, anyone with long hair, driving a Volkswagen bus, the hippie vehicle of choice, stood a good chance of being pulled over by the police. The dirty hippie stigma was radically intensified, as was adult contempt for youthful idealism. I didn't have a VW, but I had a great old white Plymouth sedan. I'd painted a sunburst on the hood, an eagle on the rear, and installed colorful patchwork seat covers. To me, my car was a work of art. Before the crime, all kinds of people would wave at me with an admiring thumbs up at my artfully renovated car. After the crime, people frowned. My car now represented a defiant gesture against the establishment. Mae Brussels, a popular public radio commentator, decided in all seriousness that it was a conspiracy. The so-called Manson murders were actually orchestrated by military intelligence in order to destroy the counterculture movement. It's no different from the special forces in Vietnam, disguised as Viet Cong, killing and slaughtering to make the Viet Cong look bad. This was a far-fetched theory, but paranoia was a reasonable response for the systematic harassment of the Flower Children. Aspects of mainstream middle-class society were implicitly criticized by many of the alternative values espoused by the counterculture of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Collectivity, familial fluidity, environmentalism, domestic cooperation, ecumenism, child-centeredness, independence, vegetarianism, emotional and physical intimacy, health consciousness, liberal use of soft drugs, anti-materialism, artistry, economic equity and efficiency, relaxation, pacifism, sexual freedom, and love-based spirituality. The fear and harassment of hippies that occurred after the crimes was as destructive to healthy communes as it was to those already dysfunctional. It was as if the dominant culture, in cahoots with the media, had been waiting for the Manson family to happen so that they would have proof that the hippie movement was no good. The antagonism between hippies and straight society was based on their antithetical values. In the context of social disruptions, the Manson murders were a convenient excuse for a backlash. Parents were warning their hippie kids, "See what could happen to you?" May 23, 1977. The drug issue. The fear of drugs accelerated with the Manson crimes, one among many factors leading to a worldwide war on illicit drugs led by Presidents Nixon and Reagan and their successors. The issue of drugs in the second trial was significant because the prosecution's case required that Leslie be perceived as being in her right mind the night of the LaBianca murders. Leslie's lawyer, Max Keith, argued that Leslie was suffering from a severe and debilitating mental impairment at the time of the murders. To buttress his point, he brought in Dr. Lester Grinspoon from Harvard. An expert witness on LSD, he was one of the 5 male psychiatrists who testified in the second trial that Leslie was incapable of meaningfully premeditating or deliberating the murders. With no nuance or irony, Stephen Kay, who fought so hard against the theory that Leslie had been brainwashed by Manson, objected to the inclusion of this witness. He said he feared the psychiatrist would brainwash, his word, the jury. Exposing his lack of knowledge of LSD's prolonged and potentially recurrent effects, Kay emphasized that none of the defendants were on LSD the nights of the murders, to ward off a judgment of diminished responsibility. He lost the argument. Dr. Grinspoon did testify. I had particular interest in Grinspoon's testimony on LSD because I had, over the course of 3 years in the late 60s and early 70s, ingested LSD 6 different times, always with skilled guides in calm, natural environments among a few close friends. Each trip was a joyful, soulful, sensual, energetic, surreal, introspective, meditative, and awakening experience. Acid, as LSD was called, was so powerful that I couldn't imagine regularly or casually consuming it. My experiences had all been totally pleasant, unlike some people's bad trips. My curiosity satisfied, and in some ways my consciousness raised, I stopped. The quantities of LSD ingested by Manson's followers, at his instruction and through his provision, were excessive. They used LSD at least twice a week for many months, which would surely help kill followers' egos. One question posed to Dr. Grinspoon was whether LSD influences people to commit murder, or whether the law of averages would produce a few murders committed by people who are on LSD trips. He said that, in fact, close to 100% of people who take LSD do not murder, and conversely, a vast majority of persons convicted are not users of LSD. Alcohol is the drug most commonly associated with homicide and other crimes of violence. If the murders couldn't be blamed on the drug, the murders were Leslie's responsibility. She couldn't plead that the drug made her do it, which she had never claimed, but it could be a mitigating factor in her sentencing. The expert discussed how LSD makes people introverted and given to fantasies, visceral feelings, and hallucinatory experience. In his view, when tripping, people are easy to influence, and they have a reduced capacity to reflect on the gravity of an act or the consequences. On acid, they create their own reality, but are also impressionable. The doctor confirmed that a person's personality structure and the setting in which the drug is taken is as important as the properties of the drug, in terms of its effects. In Leslie's case, as recounted by the psychiatrist, she first took LSD at age 15. Leslie believed she was 16. An indulgence associated in her mind with drifting between her father's home and her boyfriend's. When she was with Manson, the doctor said, Leslie surrendered herself to him through sequential processes mediated by LSD. The doctor testified that when he interviewed Leslie in the jail, he found her to be very forthright, and that he had more confidence that she is telling me the truth than I usually do after interviewing someone for 9 hours. He concluded that she had not been able to premeditate and deliberate a homicide in 1969 and was not accountable for her actions. He conceded that she knew, at the time, that killing was against the law, but she believed in a higher law. Her duty to Charles Manson overwhelmed any other duty. She didn't think of murder in the same way we do. When asked if she might still be under Manson's influence, he replied, "Absolutely not." He described her as her own person, a stable person, emotionally healthy, but not complacent with herself. Surprisingly, since he gave it no weight, Stephen Kay questioned the psychiatrist as to why Leslie waited until she thought Mrs. LaBianca was dead before stabbing her, to which the doctor replied that she was acting on instruction from her co-defendants. Kay countered that she'd taken part in the robbery on her own volition, to which the psychiatrist pointed out that they had taken no items of significant value, just food, clothes, and collector coins for their immediate needs. The more serious theft of Mr. LaBianca's wallet was committed by Manson while the women were waiting outside before the murders, for the purpose of planting diversionary evidence in a black neighborhood. Leslie herself discounts any direct effects of LSD on her participation in the crime. She points out that, like a lot of family members, she'd been using LSD before meeting Manson, and had never had violent thoughts or behaved violently in any way. To the contrary, she enjoyed mellow trips. But in Leslie's interview with Barbara Walters prior to her second trial, while she didn't blame the LSD directly for her participation in the crime, she did attribute the effects of the drug to the choices she made, which led her to Manson and made her vulnerable to his authority. Barbara Walters. Miss Van Houten, at the time of these murders, there were many people, many parents, who, aside from the horror of the murders, asked, "Could this have been my child?" This was the hippie period. This was the period of Haight-Ashbury. You ran away from home at 17 and got involved in this kind of life. Do you know why? Leslie. Yes. The main reason for my running away was because of my amount of participation in dropping acid. I started when I was about 16. At the beginning, I could still live, go to school, and more or less living within the structure of society. But the more I dropped acid, the harder it was to relate to different people, other than the people who were dropping acid. Would you take LSD every day? Not every day, but at least a couple of times a week. Were you almost always in some drug state? Yes. When you drop acid at first, it's a 9-hour experience. At first, you can go back to work on Monday. But the more you take it, the more you become lost in whatever, while you're on acid, is real, and the less you're able to relate to others. The more isolated I became from people with contrary viewpoints, the more I became totally immersed in acid reality, and it's a fairy tale world. In the courtroom, Dr. Grinspoon pointed out that whereas an acid trip generally lasts for no more than 8 to 10 hours, the effect of altered awareness, with sharper mental engagement and greater sensitivity to visceral and sensual experience, may stay with the person. Brainwashing activity could be more efficient with subjects under the direct or aftermath influence of hallucinogens. They would be more pliable, more open to suggestion, less resistant. In my experience, LSD dissolved the mind-spirit-body split. Mental images, such as flying, were experienced physically. Long after the trip ended, my physical memory recalled the mental image as though it had been an actual occurrence, even though I knew rationally that it couldn't have objectively happened in the material world. That which was not real became, in the realm of hallucinatory fantasy, real, again, through memory, and was therefore imaginable. At least intuitively, Manson understood this dynamic. All sources agree that in the weeks leading to the murders, he repeated to his disciples again and again biblical and lyrical images full of fire and brimstone, while ensuring that LSD was consumed frequently. As for whether LSD causes violence, Grinspoon said, nothing is without exception. The overwhelming evidence, however, suggests that LSD has the opposite effect. It causes people to be passive and receptive. A powerful guru can take hold of the minds of his subjects while they are under the effects of LSD and reinforce his authority over them in times when they are not under the drug's effects. This was surely the case with Charles Manson. There is no way of knowing to what extent LSD was a factor in Manson's successful encroachment on his disciples' minds. Other factors like his dramatic rhetoric, riddles, insights, tenderness, and energy added to his power over them. There was also the fact that the youths were alienated from the mainstream prior to their encounter with him. The socio-historic time in which the crimes were committed was a major factor, a time when dropping acid was common. To simply blame LSD would be as short-sighted as simply blaming Charles Manson. On an acutely interactional level, the young women's gendered readiness to obey his enigmatic instructions, the drug's preparedness effects, Manson's charisma and coercion, and the disrupted social conditions across color and class that set the context for the crimes all converged. The psychiatrist informed the court that there could be no single, simple explanation for what caused the Manson murders. In his view, anyone who believed fervently in any dogma could have done it if they had unqualified loyalty to their leader. Closed-minded true believers, however, they come to their beliefs, and whatever those beliefs may be, can be dangerous. There is another drug-related issue not discussed by Dr. Grinspoon in court that may have been a factor in the murders. Manson's delusional thinking and manipulative orchestration of violence and his followers' receptivity to him may have been helped along by other drugs. Marijuana was commonplace. LSD was particularly valued by Manson. But significantly, according to Paul Watkins' testimony in the first trial, Manson himself took smaller LSD doses than he gave to the women. After their association with bikers who were involved in drug deals and who were more involved in amphetamines than in acid, the use of speed became commonplace with some members of the family, perhaps especially Charles Watson and Susan Atkins. Although most of the girls did not use speed, it is the view of Dr. David E. Smith, director of the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic and an expert toxicologist, that the turn from psychedelics to amphetamines was critical in changing the nature of the family's activities. As he stated, high doses of amphetamines really do create a paranoid delusional system. Incidental examples of destructive leaders who favored amphetamines as their drug of choice are Adolf Hitler and Jim Jones. Certainly, from what I've heard from the women, there was a distinct change in the ambience of the family, coincident with the release of the White Album and the arrival of Manson's new biker friends early in 1969. Manson was behaving erratically and irrationally, with increased talk about violence and death, the violence necessary, the death inconsequential. He became obsessed with the plan he called Helter Skelter. If Manson was using amphetamines, that would partly explain why he underwent radical changes within months. He became frenetic with negative energy that, for Manson, translated into violence. LSD at the time was a meditative, counterculture drug that evoked the feeling of peace and love, the hippie mantra. Psychedelic bands, notably the Jefferson Airplane, were in vogue, often with both musicians and the crowd under the effect of hallucinogens, much as ecstasy became the drug of choice for young people going to all-night rave parties in the 1990s. There was nothing shocking about learning from the press that some of the murder victims at the Tate House had themselves indulged in LSD. But the combination, on the one hand, experiencing sharp increases of awareness, including but beyond the physical world through LSD, and on the other hand, experiencing the nervous, erratic, aggressive energy of speed, would produce a severe psychological and physical disorientation. Manson's followers were so well programmed to follow him that his new paranoid irrationalities seemed no more outrageous to them than the magical, loving, father-protector ways with which he'd cultivated their devotion to him. June 8th to 15th, 1977. Leslie speaks. For almost 2 months, the court heard testimony from former members of the family and a variety of experts to the effect that Manson had brainwashed the whole lot of them. This was consistently portrayed by witnesses for the defense as a dangerously powerful madman who preyed on the vulnerability and gullibility of youth to feed his damaged ego. But, as Leslie's prosecutor repeatedly reminded the court, Manson was not on trial there. He was already convicted and in a maximum security prison, most likely for the rest of his life. It was Leslie who needed to account for what she had done, and a transfer of blame would be received cynically for good reason. The courtroom was packed when it came time for Leslie to speak. Her interrogator, Stephen Kay, had assisted the legendary Vincent Bugliosi 6 years before. The external contrast between the two men's styles was pronounced. Bugliosi was tailored and entrepreneurial. Kay was earnestly serving the role of avenger, trumpeter of justice. When Stephen Kay cross-examined Leslie, he questioned her about the Self-Realization Fellowship, which she joined as a teenager, for a time practicing celibacy with thoughts of becoming a yogic renunciate, that is, a Buddhist nun. In her testimony, she affirmed that she believed in reincarnation. Your consciousness has been with you since the beginning of time, and you just keep coming back to work out your karma. Karma is a balancing system within yourself. Whatever you do, you'll get back, whether it's in this life or another one. Kay's intention was to discredit Leslie by showing that she had been deviant even before she met Manson, that she walked into the crime with her eyes wide open. He questioned her about her early drug use. She reiterated that she'd taken acid with her boyfriend and teenage friends. She described finding peace at Spawn Ranch, where the goals were to give up personal identities so we'd be of one thought. Be humble, sensitive to the earth. It was what I'd been looking for. Leslie described how Manson would mirror her face with his own expression if she was feeling down, and how he would mill around and make comments about your daily growth. She was a persuasive witness on her own behalf. Although she had maintained her composure throughout the proceedings, when asked to recall the crime, she became distraught and agitated, gulping for air through tears. When calmed, she testified that, at the time of the crime, she was surprised to find that she had no stomach for what was happening. Her inability to follow instructions at the LaBianca home in 1969 was a matter of shame to her then. I should have accomplished more than just stab a body. In response to her lawyer's question about how she was feeling almost 8 years after the crime, Leslie replied, "I'm very ashamed." This time meaning not for her poor performance, but for having associated with the brutal murders in any way at all. About Manson, 6 years after their original sentencing, she said, "I try not to hate him. I feel like that's investing in emotion. I've been able to live the last several years without him being a part of my life." The defendant appeared to impress the jury, and spectators would talk about her in the hallway or on the LA County Courthouse steps. She was seen as honest, sensitive, intelligent, visibly humbled, ashamed, and bearing the bewilderment of years in segregated confinement. Her face wore an uncontrived blend of pain and wonder. It was easy to believe in the innocence of this woman on the stand, who was not the girl who had been present at the LaBianca murders. In his summary, Stephen Kay, as if the LaBiancas were irrelevant, talked about the Tate murders, displaying the Tate photographs, rehashed the Tate details, and instructed jurors firmly, "When you go in that jury room, society will be watching you." The jury could not unanimously agree with Stephen Kay's insistence that Leslie deserved to be reconvicted of first-degree murder. The trial ended in a hung jury after 25 days of deliberation. 7 voted for conviction on first-degree murder, and 5 voted for manslaughter, which would have meant immediate release on the basis of the time already served. A mistrial was declared, which gave Leslie reason for optimism for a plea bargain resolution. Normally, in a widely split decision in a first-degree murder case, the defendant would be able to plea bargain for a second-degree murder conviction. Stephen Kay blamed the deadlock on jury emotionalism, saying that one juror identified Leslie with her daughter, and that she had had dreams that it was her daughter in jail. He was particularly upset that the deadlock was so significant, with just under half the jurors holding out for a manslaughter conviction. He had not won the case. He still held the trump card, however. He refused to agree to a plea bargain. This meant that, for the first time in California history, a hung jury in a first-degree murder case led to yet another trial. That trial was scheduled for March 1978.